In the unforgiving prairie of 1884, where survival meant swallowing pride and love was a luxury few could afford, a barren woman's tragedy became another's salvation. When Isabella Hartley's own parents sold her to settle debts, marking her as worthless for her inability to bear children, she never imagined that a grief-stricken widower with 4 motherless children would see in her exactly what his broken family needed. But sometimes the deepest wounds create space for the most unexpected healing. Stay with me until the very end of this story, and please comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale of second chances has traveled across the world. The autumn wind of 1884 carried more than just the scent of dying leaves across the Nebraska prairie. It carried whispers, rumors, and the kind of desperate hope that clung to broken souls like morning frost. Isabella Hartley pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped down from the rickety wagon that had brought her to Millbrook, a town so small it barely deserved the name. Her carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world felt impossibly heavy in her calloused hands. At 26, Isabella had the kind of beauty that spoke of strength rather than delicacy, auburn hair that refused to stay pinned, green eyes that had seen too much, and hands that knew the weight of both life and death. She'd spent the last 8 years moving from town to town, prairie to prairie, following wherever her skills as a midwife and healer were needed. It was honest work, sacred work, but it was also lonely work for a woman who would never experience the very miracle she helped bring into the world. The irony wasn't lost on her. Isabella Hartley, the woman who had delivered more babies than she could count, who had guided countless mothers through their most vulnerable moments, who had earned the trust of women across 3 states. Isabella Hartley was barren. The doctors in Chicago had been quite clear about that, their clinical words cutting deeper than any physical pain. Complete infertility, most unfortunate for a woman of your circumstances. Her circumstances, as if being sold by her own parents to settle their debts wasn't unfortunate enough, as if being returned like defective merchandise when her new husband discovered she couldn't bear him sons wasn't the deepest kind of humiliation a woman could endure. But that was behind her now, or so she told herself every morning when she woke to face another day of starting over. Miss Hartley. The voice belonged to a plump woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted aprons. I'm Martha Chen, the pastor's wife. We've been expecting you. Isabella forced a smile, the kind she'd perfected over years of meeting new people who knew nothing of her past. Thank you for having me, Mrs. Chen. Dr. Morrison's telegram said there was a woman due any day now. Indeed, Sarah Butler, poor thing. 3rd baby and her husband's away on cattle drive. But that's not well. There's something else. Martha's eyes darted around nervously, as if the very buildings had ears. We have another situation that might require your particular expertise. They walked slowly down the dusty main street, past the general store and the blacksmith shop, past the small church that seemed to lean slightly to the left, as if it were listening to secrets. Martha spoke in hushed tones about the town, the people, the way things worked in Millbrook. But Isabella could sense there was something more, something Martha was working up the courage to say. There's a man, Martha finally said, stopping abruptly in front of the small boarding house that would be Isabella's temporary home. Jonathan Kane lost his wife 2 years back during childbirth. Terrible thing, just terrible. Left him with 4 young ones. The oldest is barely 12 and the youngest... Martha shook her head. Little Theo was just 2 when it happened. Hasn't spoken a word since his mama died. Isabella felt her chest tighten. She'd seen this before, children so traumatized by loss that they simply stopped. Stopped speaking, stopped playing, sometimes stopped eating. It was one of the cruelest tricks grief could play. Mr. Kane, Martha continued, lowering her voice even further, he's not been the same. Refuses help from anyone in town, barely speaks to neighbors. Those children are half wild now, running around without proper care. The older ones try their best, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "What does this have to do with me?" Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew. Martha's cheeks flushed pink. "Well, some of us ladies have been talking, and we thought perhaps you might be willing to look in on them. Not officially, of course. Jonathan Kane is too proud to accept charity. But maybe if you happened to be in the area, maybe if little Theo took a fall or something." Isabella understood immediately. The women of Millbrook wanted her to engineer an excuse to get close to the Kane family, to somehow work her way into their lives and provide the care those children desperately needed. It was manipulation, certainly, but it was manipulation born of genuine concern. "Where do they live?" she heard herself asking. "About 3 miles north of town. Big ranch, you can't miss it." "But Isabella," Martha caught her arm, "be careful. Jonathan Kane isn't cruel, but he is not the man he used to be. Grief does terrible things to people, and he's been drowning in it for 2 years." That evening, Isabella sat in her small room at the boarding house, staring out the window toward the north, where the Kane ranch lay hidden in the gathering darkness. She'd unpacked her few belongings, hung her 2 decent dresses in the narrow wardrobe, and arranged her medical supplies with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 100 times before. But her mind kept wandering to a silent little boy named Theo and his father, who was drowning in grief. She'd known grief herself. The death of her younger brother when she was 18 had nearly broken her. But she'd had her work, her calling, her purpose. What did a man like Jonathan Kane have when everything he'd built his life around crumbled to dust? The next morning brought news that Sarah Butler had indeed gone into labor, and Isabella spent 14 hours helping bring a healthy baby girl into the world. It was good work, satisfying work, and for those precious hours she felt like herself again, competent, needed, valuable. But as she walked back to town in the early dawn light, her feet somehow turned north instead of south. She told herself she was just curious, just wanted to see the lay of the land. She told herself she was getting familiar with the area in case of emergencies. She told herself a lot of things as she walked the 3 miles to Kane Ranch, but the truth was simpler and more complicated. She felt drawn there by something she couldn't name. The ranch, when it came into view, was both impressive and heartbreaking. The house was large and well built, the kind of home that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. The barn was solid, the fencing mostly intact, the field showed signs of good management, but there was an air of neglect. 2 weeds growing where they shouldn't, a gate hanging crooked clothes on a line that had been forgotten and were now stiff with overnight frost. Isabella was still taking in the scene when she heard shouting. "Get down from there! Damn it, Theo! Get down right now!" A man's voice rough with panic and anger. Isabella looked toward the sound and saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair that needed cutting, standing beneath a large oak tree and shouting up into the branches. And there, perhaps 15 feet up, was a small boy with corn silk hair, frozen with fear on a branch that looked far too thin to support even his slight weight. Isabella didn't think. She just moved. "Don't shout," she called out as she approached, her voice carrying the calm authority she'd developed over years of medical emergencies. "You're scaring him more." The man, Jonathan Kane, it had to be, whirled toward her, and Isabella got her first real look at him. Martha had been right. Grief had carved deep lines around his eyes, had drawn his mouth into a permanent expression of wariness. He was probably handsome once, but now he looked like a man who'd been fighting a losing battle for too long. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, but his eyes were already turning back to the boy in the tree. "I'm Isabella Hartley, the new midwife," she said, moving to stand beside him and looking up at little Theo. The child's face was pale with terror, his small hands gripping the branch so tightly his knuckles were white. "Hello there, sweetheart," she called up gently. "That's quite an adventure you're having. Followed anyone around? Trusted anyone new?" Jonathan's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "Not since Sarah died. He used to hide whenever strangers came to the house." Isabella watched Theo carefully lift an egg, from a nest, his face serious with concentration. "Children know when someone cares about them," she said simply. "They can sense it." "And do you—" The question came out rougher than Jonathan had obviously intended. "Care about them, I mean." Isabella turned to look at him directly, struck by the vulnerability she saw in his dark eyes. This was a man who'd been hurt before, who'd learned to be suspicious of kindness, because he'd seen how quickly it could be withdrawn. "Yes," she said without hesitation, "I care about them very much." Something in Jonathan's expression shifted, a wall coming down just slightly. "They care about you too. Emma talks about you constantly. The twins have started trying to impress you with increasingly dangerous stunts. And Theo, I come because this feels like home to me in a way no place has in years." Jonathan's eyes widened slightly, as if her honesty had caught him off guard. "Isabella. Papa, Miss Isabella." Theo's voice cut through the moment as he came running toward the house egg basket, forgotten in his excitement. He was pointing toward the barn, bouncing on his toes with urgency. "What is it, son?" Jonathan asked, instantly alert to potential trouble. Theo grabbed Isabella's hand and began pulling her toward the barn, his eyes bright with excitement. When they reached Sunshine's makeshift nest in an empty stall, Isabella understood immediately. "Oh my goodness," she breathed, kneeling down beside the orange tabby. "Look what we have here." 5 tiny kittens, still wet from birth, were nestled against Sunshine's side. The cat looked exhausted but proud, purring loudly as she cleaned her babies. "Emma, James, Jacob," Jonathan called, and within moments all 4 children were crowded around the stall, voices hushed with wonder. "They're so tiny," Emma whispered, "and they can't even see yet." Jacob observed with scientific interest. "Will they be okay?" James asked, looking anxiously at Isabella. "They look perfect to me," Isabella assured him, checking each kitten carefully. "Sunshine did a wonderful job. She's a very good mama." The words caught in her throat unexpectedly, and she had to look away from the scene of maternal contentment. The familiar ache of her own childlessness rose up like a tide, threatening to drown the joy of the moment. "Isabella," Jonathan's voice was gentle, concerned. "Are you all right?" She forced a smile, but she could see from his expression that it wasn't convincing. "I'm fine, it's always amazing to witness new life coming into the world." But later, after the children had reluctantly been pulled away from the kittens for dinner, Jonathan found her sitting alone on the porch steps, staring out at the sunset. "You didn't fool me," he said, settling beside her with careful distance between them. "Back there in the barn, something upset you." Isabella considered deflecting, making light of it, but something about the quiet understanding in his voice made her want to tell the truth. "I can't have children," she said simply, the words coming out flat and matter-of-fact. "I've helped bring hundreds of babies into the world, but I'll never have one of my own." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said finally. That must hurt in ways I can't imagine." "It does." Isabella pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Especially when people assume that's what I want most, or when they look at me with pity because I'm an unmarried woman getting older." "Is that why you left your last place?" Isabella let out a bitter laugh. "Actually, I was married once, for about 6 months. When my husband discovered I was barren, he had the marriage annulled and sent me back to my parents like defective merchandise." "Jesus," Jonathan breathed. "My parents weren't thrilled either. They'd arranged the marriage to settle some debts, you see. When I came home in disgrace, unable to fulfill the one purpose they thought I was good for," Isabella shook her head. "Let's just say I decided it was time to make my own way in the world." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky deepened from gold to purple. Finally, Jonathan spoke again. "For what it's worth, I think any man who would cast aside a woman like you is a fool." The words were simple, but the sincerity behind them made Isabella's throat tight with emotion. Thank you, she whispered. I mean it. Jonathan turned to look at her directly. You've brought more life and warmth to this house in a few weeks than we've had in 2 years. You've made my children smile again, made them feel safe again. That's worth more than—" he gestured vaguely. "More than whatever it is society thinks women are supposed to provide." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. "Jonathan." "I know it's not my place to say," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "and I know we barely know each other, but watching you with my children, seeing how naturally you care for them, any child would be lucky to have you as a mother. Biology be damned." The tears spilled over then, and Isabella found herself crying for the first time in months. Not the bitter tears of self-pity she'd shed in private, but something cleaner, more healing. "I'm sorry," she gasped, trying to wipe her face. "I don't usually—" "Don't apologize," Jonathan said firmly. "Not for this. Not ever." Without thinking, he reached over and gently brushed away a tear with his thumb, the simple gesture so tender that Isabella's breath caught. They looked at each other in the growing darkness, and Isabella felt something shift between them, something deeper than friendship, more dangerous than simple attraction. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, and her heart pounded with equal parts hope and terror. But then Emma's voice called from inside the house, asking about bedtime stories, and the moment shattered. "I should go," Isabella said, rising quickly to her feet. "It's getting late." "Isabella, wait." Jonathan stood as well, reaching out as if to stop her. "I didn't mean to. That is, I hope I didn't overstep." "You didn't," she said quickly. "You were very kind. It's complicated, isn't it?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "Yes, it is." But as Isabella walked home through the moonlit prairie, she found herself thinking not about the complications, but about the way Jonathan had looked at her when he'd called any child lucky to have her as a mother, about the way Theo trusted her completely, and Emma sought her approval, and the twins competed for her attention. For the first time in her adult life, Isabella began to wonder if there might be more than one way to build a family. The answer came sooner than she expected, in the form of a crisis that would test every bond she'd begun to form with the Kane family. It started 3 days later when Theo developed a fever. At first it seemed like nothing serious. Children got fevers all the time, and Theo was particularly susceptible to every cold and cough that made its way through town. But by the second day the fever had climbed dangerously high, and Theo had begun having difficulty breathing. Emma came to town to fetch Isabella, riding bareback on her father's horse, with tears streaming down her face. "Please come," she gasped as soon as Isabella opened her door. "Theo's really sick, and Papa doesn't know what to do, and I think Theo might die." Isabella didn't waste time with questions. She grabbed her medical bag and followed Emma back to the ranch, her mind already running through possibilities and treatments. She found Jonathan pacing the parlor like a caged animal, his face gray with worry and exhaustion. "Thank God you're here," he said as soon as he saw her. "I don't know what to do. He can't seem to catch his breath, and his fever won't break, and "Let me see him," Isabella said calmly, already moving toward the stairs. Theo was in his small bedroom, lying so still and pale that Isabella's heart clenched with fear. His breathing was shallow and labored, and when she placed her hand on his forehead, the heat nearly scorched her palm. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, immediately beginning her examination. "Since this morning," Jonathan said from the doorway. "The fever started 3 days ago, but today he got so much worse so quickly." Isabella listened to Theo's chest, felt his pulse, checked his throat. Her professional calm never wavered, but inside alarm bells were ringing. This wasn't a simple cold or fever, this was pneumonia, and in a child as young and small as Theo, it could be fatal. "I need you to get me some things," she said, turning to address Jonathan and the older children who had gathered anxiously in the doorway. "Emma, I need you to boil water and keep it boiling. James, Jacob, I need you to gather as much firewood as you can. We need to keep this room very warm. Jonathan, I need you to ride to town and get these supplies from Dr. Morrison." She quickly wrote out a list of medicines and supplies, her handwriting steady despite the urgency she felt. "Is he going to be all right?" Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. Isabella looked at the little girl's tear-stained face, then at the two boys who were trying so hard to be brave, then at Jonathan, who looked like he was barely holding himself together. "I'm going to do everything I can," she said honestly. "But I need all of you to help me, and I need you to be very brave. Can you do that?" All three older children nodded solemnly, and Jonathan squeezed her shoulder briefly before heading out to get the supplies. The next 24 hours were the longest of Isabella's life. She never left Theo's bedside, monitoring his breathing, sponging him with cool water to bring down the fever, administering the medicines Dr. Morrison had sent. The other children helped however they could. Emma kept fresh water boiling. The twins took turns keeping the fire going, and Jonathan simply refused to leave. "You should rest," Isabella told him during the darkest hours before dawn, when Theo's breathing had become so labored she wasn't sure he'd make it to morning. "I can't," Jonathan said simply. "I lost my wife. I won't lose my son, too." Isabella understood. She felt the same desperate determination, the same refusal to accept defeat. Somewhere over the past weeks, these children had become hers in all the ways that mattered, and she would fight for Theo's life with everything she had. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky pale pink outside Theo's window, Isabella felt his forehead and realized with shock that his fever had finally broken. His breathing was still rough, but it was deeper, more regular. "Jonathan," she whispered, not daring to speak too loudly, I think he's going to be all right." Jonathan looked up from where he'd been holding Theo's hand, hope and exhaustion warring in his expression. When he felt his son's cooler forehead for himself, his shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Isabella, I don't know how to thank you. You saved his life." But Isabella was looking at Theo's face, watching as his eyes fluttered open for the first time in days. The little boy's gaze found hers immediately, and to her amazement his mouth curved in the faintest of smiles. "Hey there, sweetheart," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You gave us quite a scare." Theo's lips moved, and Isabella leaned closer to hear what he was trying to say. "Mama," he whispered so quietly she almost missed it. The word hit Isabella like a physical blow. She looked up at Jonathan, expecting to see hurt or anger in his face. Surely he wouldn't want his son calling another woman by that precious name. But Jonathan's eyes were filled with tears, and when he spoke, his voice was full of wonder. He spoke, he breathed. "Isabella," he spoke. It was then that Isabella realized Theo wasn't asking for his mother, he was naming her. Somehow in his fever-addled mind, he had decided that she was his mama, and now that he was getting better, he wanted to make sure she knew. "Safe lady?" Theo whispered, using his old name for her. "My safe lady mama." The words broke something open inside Isabella's chest, something that had been locked away for so long she'd forgotten it existed. This child, this precious, brave little boy, was claiming her as his own, and she realized with startling clarity that she wanted to be claimed. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered back, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I'm your safe lady, and I'm not going anywhere." When she looked up, she found Jonathan watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude and something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken. "Isabella," he began, but she shook her head. "Not now," she said softly. Let's just be grateful he's going to be all right." But as the days passed and Theo grew stronger, Isabella found it harder and harder to ignore what was happening between her and Jonathan. The crisis had stripped away their careful politeness, their cautious distance. When he looked at her now, she saw something raw and honest in his eyes, something that matched the feelings she was trying so hard to deny. The problem was that Millbrook was a small town, and people talked. They'd noticed Isabella spending more and more time at the Kane Ranch. They'd seen the way the children clung to her, The way Jonathan's face had lost some of its haunted look, and they had opinions about it. "It's not proper," Martha Chen said one afternoon when Isabella came into town for supplies. Her voice was kind but firm. A young, unmarried woman spending so much time alone with a widower, people are starting to talk. "Let them talk," Isabella replied, perhaps more sharply than she should have. "Those children needed care, and I provided it. There's nothing improper about that." "Of course not, dear, but appearances matter, especially in a small town. And there are some who are saying, well, they're saying that perhaps you've become too attached to a family that isn't your own." The words stung because they contained just enough truth to hurt. Isabella had become attached desperately, completely attached to Jonathan and his children. She loved them with a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity, but loving them and being able to have them were two entirely different things. "I understand your concern," Isabella said carefully, "and I'll be more mindful of appearances in the future." But even as she said the words, she knew she couldn't stay away. The Kane Ranch had become her refuge, her joy, the place where she felt most like herself. How could she give that up because of small-town gossip? The answer came that very evening when she arrived at the ranch to find Jonathan waiting for her on the porch, his expression serious. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Isabella's heart sank. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she wasn't prepared for how much it would hurt. "I heard what happened in town today," Jonathan continued. "Martha Chen's husband came by this afternoon. He was very kind about it, but the message was clear." "Jonathan, I can explain." "You don't need to explain anything." His voice was firm, determined, but I do need to say something that I should have said weeks ago." Isabella braced herself for the gentle dismissal, the careful explanation of why she couldn't continue visiting, why it was better for everyone if she stayed away. Instead, Jonathan stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "I'm in love with you," he said simply. "I've been falling in love with you since the day you talked Theo down from that tree, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. "Jonathan, I know it's complicated." He continued, the words coming out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for too long. "I know you have your own life, your own plans. I know you could probably do better than a widowed rancher with 4 children and more baggage than any woman should have to deal with. But Isabella, you've brought my family back to life. You've made my children smile again, made them feel safe and loved. And you've made me remember what it feels like to hope for something more than just getting through each day." Isabella stared at him, her mind reeling. This wasn't what she'd expected, wasn't what she'd prepared herself for. "The children love you," Jonathan said, his voice growing softer, more vulnerable. "And not just as a friend or a caregiver. They love you like a mother. Theo's been calling you Mama for weeks now, and the older ones. Emma asked me yesterday if you might want to stay forever." "Jonathan, stop," Isabella whispered, tears flowing freely now. "You don't understand. I can't. We can't." "Why not?" He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Give me one good reason why we can't try to build something together." "Because I'm barren," Isabella said, the words torn from her throat. "Because I can't give you more children, and what if someday you want them? Because I'm damaged goods, and the whole town knows it, and you deserve better than someone who comes with so much scandal and shame." For a moment, Jonathan just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he began to shake his head. "Isabella Hartley," he said, his voice full of wonder and something that might have been amusement, "you are the most stubborn, self-sacrificing woman I've ever met." "I'm trying to be practical." "You're trying to be a martyr," he corrected gently. "Do you really think I care about having more children when I can barely manage the 4 I have? Do you think I give a damn what the people in town say about your past, when I've seen who you really are? But, no buts." Jonathan's voice was firm now, commanding. "I've seen you with my children. I've watched you fight for Theo's life like he was your own flesh and blood. I've seen you comfort Emma when she has nightmares, teach the twins to be gentlemen, turn a house full of grief into a home full of laughter. You want to talk about being damaged. Isabella, you've helped heal every broken thing in my life. Isabella felt something crack open inside her chest, some wall she'd built around her heart beginning to crumble. I love you, Jonathan said, again more quietly now. Not despite your past, not in spite of your supposed flaws, but because of who you are, all of who you are. And if you'll have us, if you'll take a chance on a ready-made family, and a man who's still learning how to live again, then I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you're exactly what we need. Isabella looked into his face, saw the absolute sincerity there, the love that was being offered without conditions or reservations. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly seen, truly valued for exactly who she was. The whole town will talk, she said weakly, her last defense crumbling. Let them, Jonathan replied, echoing her words from earlier. We'll give them something worth talking about. And then he was kissing her, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Isabella finally stopped fighting against the tide of love that had been building inside her for weeks. When they broke apart, breathless and smiling, Isabella heard the sound of applause from the house behind them. They turned to see 4 children pressed against the parlor window, grinning and clapping with unabashed delight. I think, Isabella said, laughing through her tears, your children approve. Our children, Jonathan corrected firmly, and the word sent a thrill through Isabella's heart that she'd never expected to feel. Our children, our family, our home. It was more than she'd ever dared to dream, and it was being offered to her on a silver platter by a man who saw her not as broken or lacking, but as exactly what his family needed. As the children tumbled out of the house to surround them with hugs and excited chatter about weddings and new mothers and whether Isabella would make them pancakes for breakfast. Now Isabella realized that sometimes the most unexpected gifts came wrapped in the most unlikely packages. She'd come to Millbrook looking for a fresh start, a place to hide from her shameful past and build a quiet, unremarkable life. Instead, she'd found love, family, and a future brighter than anything she'd ever imagined possible. The happiness that followed Jonathan's proposal felt almost too fragile to trust. Isabella moved through the next few days in a haze of wonder, still hardly believing that this man, this family had chosen her despite everything. The children had embraced the news with wholehearted enthusiasm, already making plans for the wedding and arguing over who would get to walk Isabella down the aisle since she had no family to do it. I think Papa should do it, Emma declared with the authority of her 12 years. Since he's the one marrying her. That doesn't make sense, Jacob protested. You can't walk yourself down the aisle. Then I'll do it. Theo announced, his newly recovered voice still soft but gaining strength each day. I'm her boy, and boys are supposed to protect their mamas. Isabella felt her heart clench with love every time she heard him call her that. The word had come so naturally to him after his illness, as if some fever dream had settled the matter once and for all in his young mind. But beneath the joy, Isabella couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that had settled over Millbrook like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The whispers had grown louder since Jonathan's very public declaration of love on the porch that evening. People who had once greeted her warmly now offered tight smiles and averted eyes. The women she'd helped during difficult births suddenly seemed to find excuses to avoid her company. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when Isabella arrived in town to find Mrs. Helen Cartwright waiting outside Dr. Morrison's office, her face set in lines of righteous indignation. Miss Hartley, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the street. I need to have a word with you. Isabella's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to walk calmly toward the older woman. Mrs. Cartwright was Millbrook's unofficial moral authority, a widow herself, but one who had managed to maintain perfect respectability through 20 years of carefully orchestrated social dominance. Of course, Mrs. Cartwright, how can I help you? You can help by remembering your place, the woman said coldly, and by considering the example you're setting for the young women of this town. I'm afraid I don't understand. Mrs. Cartwright's laugh was sharp and humorless. Oh, I think you understand perfectly well. Moving in on a grieving widower, seducing him with your feminine wiles while his poor wife isn't even cold in the ground. Sarah Kane died 2 years ago. Isabella interrupted, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. 2 years is nothing when it comes to proper mourning, Mrs. Cartwright snapped. And for a woman of your background to insert herself into a respectable family, to manipulate those poor motherless children into thinking she could replace their sainted mother, that's enough. Isabella's voice cut through the woman's tirade like a blade. You don't know anything about my relationship with the Kane family. I know enough. I know about your failed marriage, your barrenness, the way you've been throwing yourself at every eligible man from here to Chicago, looking for someone desperate enough to take damaged goods. The words hit Isabella like physical blows, each one designed to cut deep and leave lasting wounds. But before she could respond, another voice joined the conversation. Mrs. Cartwright. Dr. Morrison's voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. I believe you have an appointment with me this morning. Perhaps we should discuss your rheumatism inside, where it's more appropriate. The doctor's intervention gave Isabella a moment to collect herself, but Mrs. Cartwright wasn't finished. This conversation isn't over, Miss Hartley, she said, her voice dripping with malice. There are those of us in this town who won't stand by and watch a family be destroyed by an opportunistic woman with no moral compass. As Mrs. Cartwright swept past her into the doctor's office, Isabella stood frozen on the sidewalk, the woman's words echoing in her mind like poison. She was dimly aware of other people stopping to stare, of whispered conversations and pointed looks, but she couldn't seem to make her feet move. Isabella. Martha Chen's voice seemed to come from far away. Isabella, dear, are you all right? Isabella turned to find the pastor's wife looking at her with genuine concern, and the kindness in her eyes was almost Isabella's undoing. I'm fine, Isabella managed, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. No, you're not. Come on, let's get you inside, somewhere quiet. Martha gently took Isabella's arm and guided her toward the church, away from the curious stares and whispered speculations. Once inside the cool, dim sanctuary, Isabella finally allowed herself to collapse onto a pew, her carefully maintained composure crumbling. She's wrong, you know, Martha said quietly, settling beside her. Helen Cartwright has always been a bitter woman, and she's gotten worse since her own son moved away and stopped writing. But she's not entirely wrong, Isabella whispered. Oh, I am barren. I was cast off by my first husband. I don't have any family or social standing or anything to offer a man like Jonathan except love, Martha interrupted firmly. Except the way you've brought life back into that house, the way you've healed those children's hearts, the way you've given Jonathan reason to smile again. But what if she's right about the rest? What if I am just an opportunistic woman looking for security? What if Jonathan is just grateful for the help with his children, and he's confusing that with love? Martha was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentle but direct. Isabella, I've known Jonathan Kane since he was a boy. I watched him court. Sarah watched them build their life together, watched him nearly die of grief when he lost her. That man doesn't confuse gratitude with love, and he's not the type to make decisions based on convenience. Then why do I feel like such a fraud? Because you've been told all your life that your worth as a woman depends on things beyond your control, Martha said with surprising heat. Because society has convinced you that being unable to bear children makes you somehow less than, when any fool can see that motherhood is about so much more than biology. Isabella looked up at her friend through tear-blurred eyes. But what if he changes his mind? What if someday he decides he wants sons to carry on his name? Or what if the children grow tired of having a pretend mother who isn't really their own? Then you'll face that if it happens, Martha said firmly. But Isabella, you can't live your life running from what-ifs. Those children adore you. Anyone with eyes can see it. And Jonathan, the way that man looks at you is like you hung the moon and stars just for him. Isabella wanted to believe her friend's words, but Mrs. Cartwright's poison had taken root, feeding every doubt and insecurity she'd tried to bury. The walk back to the ranch felt endless, each step heavier than the last. By the time Isabella reached the familiar gate with its crooked hinge that Jonathan kept meaning to fix, she had made a decision that felt like swallowing glass. She found Jonathan in the barn mending harnesses with the patient skill of a man who'd learned to make do and mend rather than replace. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting with the smile that had become as necessary to her as breathing. "There you are," he said, setting down his tools. "How did your errands go in town?" Isabella stood in the doorway, memorizing the sight of him, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the calluses on his hands, the gentle strength in his shoulders. She tried to store it all away against the coming loneliness. "We need to talk," she said, the words coming out steadier than she'd expected. Something in her voice must have warned him, because his smile faded, and he straightened, instantly alert. "What's wrong?" "This," Isabella said, gesturing between them. "Us. It's wrong, Jonathan. The whole town can see it, and they're right to disapprove." Jonathan's face went very still. "What happened in town? It doesn't matter what happened. What matters is that I can't do this to you and the children. I can't let you ruin your reputation, your standing in the community for someone like me." "Someone like you?" Jonathan's voice was dangerously quiet. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Isabella forced herself to meet his eyes, even though it felt like looking into the sun. "You know what I mean. I'm damaged goods, Jonathan. A failed wife, a barren woman with no family and no prospects. You and the children deserve better than that." "Don't." The single word cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare stand there and repeat whatever poison someone poured in your ear today. It's not poison if it's true." Jonathan crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, stopping just close enough that she could see the fury blazing in his dark eyes. "It's not true, and you know it. Isabella, whatever someone said to you today, they didn't say anything that wasn't already true." Isabella took a step back, needing distance to maintain her resolve. "I've been fooling myself, thinking I could have this, thinking I could be part of your family, that I could be enough for you. You are enough. You're more than enough. You're everything." The raw honesty in his voice nearly shattered her determination, but Isabella forced herself to remember Mrs. Cartwright's words, the whispers, the looks. "No, I'm not. And someday you'll realize that, and then where will we be? What happens to the children when you decide you want a real wife, someone who can give you sons?" "I have sons," Jonathan said fiercely. "I have James and Jacob and Theo, and I have Emma, who's worth 10 sons to me. And I have you, or I thought I did, until you decided to throw it all away because of some busybody's opinion." Isabella felt tears starting again, but she blinked them back. "I'm trying to save us both from making a mistake. The only mistake here is you believing for 1 second that I could ever want anyone but you." Jonathan reached for her hands, but she pulled away. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "Harder?" Jonathan's voice rose raw with pain and anger. "Isabella, you're ripping my heart out and asking me not to make it harder." "Papa." Emma's voice came from the barn door, small and frightened. "What's wrong? Why are you shouting?" Isabella turned to see all 4 children standing in the doorway, their faces reflecting confusion and growing alarm. Theo was holding Emma's hand, his eyes wide and worried. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," Jonathan said, his voice gentling automatically as he addressed his daughter. "Miss Isabella and I were just having a discussion." "It didn't sound like a discussion," Jacob said with the blunt honesty of childhood. "It sounded like you were fighting." Isabella felt her heart breaking as she looked at these children who had become so precious to her. In a few months, they had become more her family than her own blood relatives had ever been. "Sometimes adults have disagreements," she said softly, kneeling down so she was at their eye level. But that doesn't mean we don't care about each other. Are you going away? Theo asked the question barely a whisper. Isabella's breath caught. She looked into his trusting face, saw the fear there, and almost lost her resolve entirely. I think it might be better if I didn't come around so much anymore, she managed. The effect of her words was immediate and devastating. Theo's face crumpled. Emma took a step backward, as if Isabella had struck her, and the twins looked at each other with identical expressions of betrayal. No, Emma said, her voice shaking. No, you can't go away. You're supposed to marry Papa. You're supposed to be our mama. Emma, you said you loved us? The girl's voice rose to a near shout, tears streaming down her face. You said you weren't going anywhere. You promised. I do love you, Isabella said desperately. I love all of you more than you'll ever know. Then why are you leaving? James demanded, his young face hard with anger. If you love us, why won't you stay? Isabella looked helplessly at Jonathan, but his face was a mask of pain and fury. She was on her own with this, and there was no good answer she could give them. Sometimes loving someone means doing what's best for them, even if it hurts, she said finally. That's stupid, Jacob said flatly. What's best for us is having you here. What's best for us is being a real family. You are a real family, Isabella insisted. You don't need me to be complete. Yes, we do. Theo's whisper was heartbreaking in its certainty. We need you, Mama. I need you. Isabella closed her eyes, the endearment hitting her like a physical blow. When she opened them again, she found Jonathan watching her with an expression that might have been contempt. Congratulations, he said quietly. You've just broken the heart of every person who ever loved you. I hope whatever Mrs. Cartwright or whoever else got to you today is satisfied. Isabella flinched as if he'd slapped her, but she forced herself to stand firm. I'm trying to protect them. I'm trying to protect all of you. From what? From being happy, from being loved. Jonathan's voice was bitter now, cold, in a way she'd never heard before. Isabella, you're not protecting anyone. You're just proving that you're exactly what that person told you, that you were a coward who runs at the first sign of trouble. The words cut deep because they held enough truth to hurt. Isabella was choosing the certainty of loneliness over the risk of eventual rejection. Maybe I am a coward, she said quietly, but at least this way, I'm the only one who gets hurt. She turned to leave, but Jonathan's voice stopped her. You're wrong about that too, he said. Look at them, Isabella. Look at what you're doing to them. Against her better judgment, Isabella turned back to see 4 children staring at her with expressions of loss and betrayal that would haunt her dreams for years to come. I'm sorry, she whispered, and then she ran. Isabella managed to make it back to town and up to her small room at the boarding house before the tears came in earnest. She collapsed on her narrow bed and sobbed until she had nothing left, her whole body shaking with the force of her grief. She'd done the right thing. She knew she'd done the right thing. It was better to end it now before the children became even more attached, before Jonathan had time to realize his mistake. Better to bear the pain alone than to watch them all slowly come to resent her for the things she couldn't give them. But knowing she'd done the right thing didn't make it hurt any less. The next few days passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Isabella threw herself into her work delivering babies and tending the sick with the same skill and compassion she'd always shown. She smiled when people spoke to her, answered questions about her patients, and pretended that her heart wasn't lying in pieces in her chest. Mrs. Cartwright made a point of stopping her on the street to express her approval of Isabella's wise decision to step back from that unfortunate situation. Other townspeople who had been cool to her over the past weeks suddenly warmed up again, as if her self-sacrifice had restored her to their good graces. It should have been satisfying, this return to respectability. Instead, it felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit properly, technically adequate, but fundamentally wrong. Isabella was walking home from a difficult birth on the 4th day after her confrontation with Jonathan when she nearly collided with Dr. Morrison outside the post office. "Isabella," he said, steadying her with a gentle hand on her arm. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she said automatically, the lie coming easily after days of practice. Dr. Morrison studied her face with the keen eyes of a man who'd spent decades learning to read people's pain. "No, you're not," he said quietly. "You look like hell, if you'll pardon the expression." Isabella tried to smile, but her face felt like it might crack from the effort. "I've been working hard. Mrs. Peterson's labor was particularly difficult. It's not work that's wearing you down, and we both know it." Dr. Morrison glanced around the busy street, then gently took her arm. "Walk with me." They strolled slowly toward the edge of town, away from curious ears and watching eyes. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Dr. Morrison broke the silence. "I've been the doctor in this town for 30 years, he said conversationally. "I've delivered most of the children, patched up most of the injuries, and held the hands of most of the dying. You learn things in 30 years of that kind of work." Isabella waited, sensing he had more to say. "You learn that love is rarer than people think it is. Real love, the kind that transforms people, that heals old wounds and builds new dreams, that's precious as gold and twice as hard to find. Dr. Morrison, you also learn," he continued as if she hadn't spoken, "that fear makes people do terrible things. Sometimes the worst thing a person ever does is born out of trying to protect themselves or someone they love from imaginary dangers." Isabella felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "The dangers aren't imaginary. People talk, and they have every right to disapprove of what? Of a good woman loving a good man and his children, of a family healing together after tragedy." Dr. Morrison stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Isabella, I knew Sarah Kane. She was a lovely woman, and Jonathan mourned her properly. But she's been gone for 2 years, and life is for the living. It's not that simple." "It never is. But sometimes we make it more complicated than it needs to be." Dr. Morrison's voice gentled. "I also knew your first husband, though I doubt you remember. He came through town about 5 years ago, drunk and boasting about how he'd rid himself of a barren wife who couldn't give him sons." Isabella stared at him in shock. "You knew Charles. I knew he was a fool and a brute, and I was glad when he moved on without causing too much trouble." Dr. Morrison's eyes were kind but firm. "Isabella, that man's rejection of you says nothing about your worth and everything about his character. Don't let his poison keep you from the happiness you deserve." "But what if Jonathan eventually feels the same way? What if he decides he wants children of his own blood? Then he would be an even bigger fool than your first husband. And frankly, I don't think Jonathan Kane has a foolish bone in his body." Dr. Morrison smiled sadly. "Child, you've got to stop borrowing trouble from tomorrow. The only moment you can control is this one, and right now you have a choice. You can keep running from love because it might hurt someday, or you can choose to trust in something beautiful." Isabella felt tears threatening again. I don't know how to stop being afraid." "You start by admitting that the thing you're most afraid of isn't Jonathan leaving you, it's believing that you deserve to be loved and then being wrong." The truth of his words hit Isabella like a thunderbolt. He was right. Deep down, beneath all her practical concerns and social worries, what truly terrified her was the possibility that she wasn't worthy of the love Jonathan and his children were offering. It was easier to reject it herself than to risk having it withdrawn later. "What if I am wrong?" she whispered. "What if I don't deserve it?" "My dear girl," Dr. Morrison said gently, "none of us deserve the love we're given. That's what makes it grace." That evening, Isabella sat in her small room as darkness fell over Millbrook, turning Dr. Morrison's words over in her mind like stones worn smooth by water. Outside her window, she could hear the sounds of families settling in for the night, mothers calling children in for baths, fathers reading bedtime stories, the comfortable murmur of people who belonged to each other. She thought about Jonathan, and the children wondered what they were doing at this moment. Were they sitting down to dinner at the big wooden table? Was someone helping Theo with his letters? Was Emma tucking her brothers into bed with the maternal care she'd been forced to develop too young? Were they missing her even a fraction as much as she was missing them? Isabella rose and moved to her small mirror, studying her reflection in the lamplight. She looked older than her 26 years, worn down by grief and fear and the weight of trying to be strong all the time. But underneath the exhaustion, she could still see traces of the woman she'd been before her life taught her to expect disappointment at every turn. Maybe Dr. Morrison was right. Maybe she was borrowing trouble, letting fear of hypothetical futures rob her of a present that could be beautiful. Maybe the real tragedy wouldn't be risking her heart and losing it, would be throwing away the greatest gift she'd ever been offered because she was too afraid to believe she deserved it. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like choosing and more like finally stopping her fight against the inevitable. She loved Jonathan Kane and his children with every fiber of her being. She could run from that love, could try to protect herself from potential hurt, but she would never stop loving them. And love without courage was just another form of selfishness. Isabella looked at her reflection one more time, straightening her shoulders and lifting her chin. Tomorrow she would swallow her pride and her fear and go back to the Kane ranch. She would apologize for her cowardice, beg for forgiveness if necessary, and fight for the family she'd been too scared to claim. But tonight she would plan exactly what she wanted to say to convince the man she loved that she was ready to be brave enough to deserve him. Isabella barely slept that night, rehearsing what she would say, how she would explain her cowardice, how she would convince Jonathan to give her another chance. But when dawn broke gray and threatening over Millbrook, bringing with it the rumble of distant thunder, she knew that all her carefully planned words would mean nothing if she didn't have the courage to face the devastation she'd left behind. She dressed with trembling hands, choosing her best dress, the deep blue one that brought out her eyes, that Jonathan had once said made her look beautiful. If she was going to bare her soul and beg for forgiveness, she wanted to look like a woman worth fighting for, not the broken creature she'd become over the past few days. The walk to the ranch felt both endless and far too short. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, with each step her mouth dry with fear and desperate hope. What if Jonathan refused to see her? What if the children turned away when she approached? What if her cowardice had damaged them too deeply for forgiveness? The first fat raindrops began to fall as she reached the gate, and Isabella took their arrival as either a very good omen or a very bad one. The ranch looked different in the pre-storm light, more desolate somehow, as if the joy she'd brought to it had fled with her departure. She was halfway up the lane when she heard the sound of a child crying, not the ordinary tears of a scraped knee or hurt feelings, but the deep, wrenching sobs of heartbreak. Isabella's steps quickened, her own fears momentarily forgotten in the face of a child's distress. The crying was coming from the oak tree where she'd first helped Theo down, and as Isabella drew closer, she could see a small figure huddled at its base. It was Theo himself, curled against the trunk, with his face buried in his knees, his thin shoulders shaking with the force of his grief. Isabella's heart shattered all over again. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Theo," she called softly. "Sweetheart, what are you doing out here?" The little boy's head shot up at the sound of her voice, his tear-streaked face a mask of disbelief and desperate hope. "Mama," he whispered the word barely audible over the growing wind. "Mama, is that really you?" Isabella dropped to her knees beside him, gathering his small, trembling body into her arms. "Yes, baby, it's really me. I'm here." Theo clung to her with desperate strength, his tears soaking through her dress. "I thought you were gone forever," he sobbed. "I thought you didn't love me anymore." "Oh, sweetheart, no." Isabella held him tighter, her own tears falling freely now. "I love you so much. I never stopped loving you, not for 1 second." "Then why did you go away?" The question came out muffled against her shoulder, but the pain in it was crystal clear. Isabella pulled back just enough to cup his face in her hands, looking directly into his eyes. "Because I was scared," she said honestly. "I was scared that maybe you didn't really need me, that maybe I wasn't good enough to be your mama." Theo's eyes widened with something that might have been anger. "That's stupid," he said with fierce conviction. "Of course we need you. Of course you're good enough. You're the best mama in the whole world." The simple, absolute faith in his voice broke something open in Isabella's chest, letting light into places that had been dark for days. "Papa's been sad," Theo continued, his lower lip trembling. "He tries to hide it, but I can tell. And Emma cries at night when she thinks we can't hear, and the twins won't talk to anybody about anything except to ask when you're coming back." Each word was like a knife to Isabella's heart, but also proof of something she'd been too afraid to truly believe, that she mattered to this family, that her absence had left a hole that couldn't be filled by anyone else. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I hurt you. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just being a coward." "Are you going to stay now?" Theo asked, his eyes searching her face. "Are you going to marry Papa and be our real mama?" Before Isabella could answer, another voice cut through the sound of the approaching storm. "Theo, Theo, where are you?" It was Jonathan, his voice tight with panic. "Damn it, son, answer me." "Papa," Theo called back, scrambling to his feet, but keeping one small hand firmly clasped in Isabella's. "Papa, I'm here, and look who came back." Isabella rose slowly, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it must be visible through her dress. She watched Jonathan appear around the side of the barn, his hair disheveled, his shirt half unbuttoned as if he'd dressed hastily. The relief on his face when he spotted Theo was quickly replaced by shock when his eyes fell on Isabella. For a long moment they stared at each other across the growing distance between them, she with desperate hope and regret written on her face, he with wariness and something that might have been barely controlled fury. "Theo, go inside," Jonathan said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "The storm's coming, and you shouldn't be out here." "But Papa, Mama came back. Inside, son, now." There was a tone in Jonathan's voice that brooked no argument, and Theo reluctantly released Isabella's hand. But before he left, he threw his arms around her waist one more time. "Don't go away again," he whispered urgently. "Please don't go away." "I won't," Isabella promised, though she wasn't sure she had the right to make such a vow. "I promise I won't go away again." Theo seemed satisfied by this and ran toward the house, leaving Isabella alone with the man whose heart she'd broken along with her own. Jonathan waited until his son was safely inside before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was cold enough to freeze the warming air around them. "You have some nerve coming back here." Isabella flinched but forced herself to meet his eyes. I know I have no right to be here after what I did, but Jonathan, I need to tell you." "Tell me what?" His voice rose slightly, the carefully controlled facade beginning to crack. "That you've changed your mind again, that you've decided we're worth the risk after all. What happens the next time someone says something cruel about your past?" "Isabella, what happens when the next Mrs. Cartwright comes along with her poison?" "There won't be a next time," Isabella said desperately. "Jonathan, I know I hurt you, I know I hurt the children, but I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. Were you?" Jonathan's eyes were hard, unforgiving. "Or are you just lonely? Are you just realizing that life in this little town isn't quite as comfortable without a ready-made family to take care of you?" The accusation hit Isabella like a physical blow, and she actually staggered backward. "You can't possibly think that's why I'm here." "Can't I? You made it pretty clear that you thought I was making a mistake, that my children and I weren't worth the risk of social disapproval. What's changed, Isabella? Did you suddenly decide that damaged goods might be good enough for the Kane family after all?" Isabella felt her temper flare at the cruel way he threw her own words back at her, but she forced it down. She deserved his anger, deserved every bit of his fury. "I realized that I was the one making the mistake," she said, her voice shaking but determined. I realized that I was throwing away the most precious thing that had ever happened to me because I was too scared to believe I deserved it. And now you've decided you do deserve it. No. The word came out more forcefully than Isabella had intended. No, Jonathan, I still don't think I deserve it. I don't deserve your love or the children's love or the chance to be part of your family. But I finally understand what Dr. Morrison tried to tell me, that none of us deserve the love we're given. That's what makes it grace. Something flickered in Jonathan's eyes, but his expression remained hard. Pretty words, Isabella, but words are easy. It's actions that matter, and your actions told me everything I needed to know about what you really think of us. Thunder rumbled overhead closer now, and the first real drops of rain began to fall. Isabella felt them on her face like tears, cold and shocking. Then let me show you with my actions, she said, stepping closer to him, despite the warning in his stance. Let me spend the rest of my life showing you how wrong I was, how much I love you and the children, how much I want to be part of this family. The rest of your life? Jonathan's laugh was bitter. Until the next crisis of confidence, until the next time someone makes you feel ashamed of who you are, there won't be a next time. You said that already. Forgive me if I don't find your promises particularly trustworthy anymore. The rain was coming harder now, soaking through Isabella's dress and plastering her hair to her head, but she didn't move. This might be her only chance, and she wasn't going to waste it seeking shelter. You're right not to trust me, she said, raising her voice to be heard over the storm. I broke your trust, and I broke the children's trust, and I have no right to ask for another chance. But Jonathan, I'm asking anyway because I love you. I love you and Emma and James and Jacob and Theo more than I love my own life, and I was a fool to let fear make me throw that away. Love. Jonathan spat the word like it tasted bitter. You have a strange way of showing love, Isabella. Running away the minute things get difficult, abandoning children who had already lost one mother, breaking promises you had no business making in the first place. Each accusation was like a lash across Isabella's heart, but she forced herself to stand firm. You're right about all of it. I did run away. I did abandon them. I did break my promises. I was a coward and a fool, and I hurt the people I love most in the world because I was too scared to fight for them. So what's different now? What's changed that makes you think you won't run again the first time someone questions your motives or your worth? Isabella took another step closer, close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. The rain was falling in earnest now, turning the ground beneath their feet to mud, but neither of them seemed to notice. What's changed is that I've spent 4 days without you, she said, her voice breaking. 4 days without Emma asking me questions about everything under the sun, without the twins competing for my attention, without Theo calling me mama and trusting me to keep him safe. 4 days of remembering what my life was like before you and Jonathan. I can't go back to that. I won't go back to that. Pretty speeches won't. I'm not making speeches. Isabella interrupted, desperation making her bold. I'm telling you the truth. The truth is that I'd rather face 1,000 Mrs. Cartwrights than spend another day without you. The truth is that I'd rather have the whole town disapprove of me than lose the family I love. The truth is that I was wrong about everything, wrong about what I deserve, wrong about what's important, wrong about what real courage looks like. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating Jonathan's face in stark black and white. Isabella could see the war playing out in his expression, anger and hurt battling against hope and desperate love. The children are watching from the window, he said quietly, and Isabella turned to see 4 faces pressed against the glass of the parlor window, their eyes wide with anxiety and hope. Then don't make them watch us destroy each other in the rain, Isabella pleaded. Jonathan, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I've proven that I'm exactly as broken and scared as everyone always said I was, but those children in there, they've already lost one mother. Don't let my cowardice take away another one. You took yourself away, Jonathan said harshly. You made the choice to leave. And now I'm making the choice to stay. Isabella shot back her own desperation, making her fierce. I'm making the choice to fight for this family, to fight for us, even if it means swallowing my pride and begging you to give me another chance. Begging. There was something almost amused in Jonathan's voice now, though his eyes were still hard. Yes, begging. Isabella dropped to her knees in the mud, not caring how it looked, not caring about her best dress or her dignity or anything except making him understand. I'm begging you, Jonathan Kane, I'm begging you to forgive me for being a coward. I'm begging you to let me prove that I can be brave enough to deserve your love. I'm begging you to give me the chance to be the mother those children need and the wife you deserve. Jonathan stared down at her, his face unreadable in the stormlight. For a long moment the only sounds were the rain and thunder and Isabella's own ragged breathing. Get up, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Not until you answer me, Isabella said stubbornly. Not until you tell me whether there's any hope left for us. Isabella, get up. You're kneeling in the mud. I don't care about the mud. I care about you and the children, and I'll kneel here until you give me an answer one way or the other. Lightning flashed again, and in its brief illumination, Isabella thought she saw something crack in Jonathan's expression. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, less harsh. You really hurt them, he said. Emma hasn't smiled once since you left. The twins keep asking when you're coming back, and when I tell them, I don't know, they look at me like I've failed them somehow. And Theo, Jonathan's voice broke slightly. Theo stopped talking again, not completely, but almost. He keeps asking for his safe lady mama, and nothing I do makes it better. Isabella felt fresh tears join the rain on her face. I know I hurt them and I hate myself for it. But Jonathan, they're the reason I came back. Not because I was lonely, not because I wanted security, but because I couldn't stand the thought of them believing they weren't worth fighting for. And what about me? The question came out barely above a whisper. What about what you did to me? Isabella looked up at him through the rain, seeing past the anger to the deep hurt underneath. You're the reason I came back too, she said softly. Jonathan, when I walked away from you, I walked away from the best part of myself. I walked away from the woman I am when I'm with you, the woman who's brave and strong and worthy of love. Without you, I'm just scared and empty and broken. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if looking for some sign of deception. Finally, slowly, he reached down and took her hands, pulling her to her feet. You're soaked through, he said, and there was a tenderness in his voice that hadn't been there before. So are you. They stood facing each other in the storm, close enough to touch, but not quite touching, both of them, trembling with cold and emotion. If I give you another chance, Jonathan said slowly, if I let you back into our lives, into our hearts, you have to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that the next time you're scared, the next time someone makes you doubt yourself or your place in this family, you'll come to me instead of running away. Promise me you'll let me help you be brave. Isabella felt her heart swell with more hope than she dared to feel in days. I promise, she whispered to Jonathan, I swear to you I will never run again. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Jonathan studied her face for another long moment, and then slowly his expression began to soften. The anger was still there and the hurt, but underneath it, Isabella could see the love that had never really gone away. The children missed you, he said quietly. Just the children. A ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. I missed you too, you stubborn, impossible woman. I missed you so much I could barely breathe. Isabella felt her knees go weak with relief. Does that mean? It means we're going to try again, Jonathan said, reaching up to cup her face in his hands. It means I'm going to trust you one more time and pray to God that you don't break my heart again. I won't, Isabella promised, covering his hands with hers. Jonathan, I swear to you, I won't break your heart again. I'd rather die than hurt you or the children like that again. Good, he said, leaning down until their foreheads touched. because I don't think any of us could survive losing you twice." And then he was kissing her, fierce and desperate and full of forgiveness, and Isabella felt like she could finally breathe again for the first time in 4 days. This kiss was different from their first, less tender, more raw, flavored with rain and tears and the salt of second chances. When they broke apart, both of them gasping, Isabella could see the children's faces pressed against the window, their expressions bright with joy and relief. "We should go inside," Jonathan said, though he made no move to release her. "In a minute," Isabella said, drinking in the sight of his face, memorizing every line and shadow. "I just need another minute to believe this is real." "It's real," Jonathan assured her, pressing another soft kiss to her lips. "We're real, and we're going to make this work." "Yes, we are," Isabella agreed, and for the first time in her adult life, she truly believed it. They walked toward the house hand in hand, soaked through but lighter somehow, as if the storm had washed away more than just the dust of the past few days. Before they reached the door, it flew open and 4 children came tumbling out, not caring about the rain or propriety or anything except welcoming Isabella home. She found herself surrounded by small bodies and fierce hugs by Emma's tears of relief and the twins' excited chatter, and Theo's whispered, "Mama, you came back, you really came back." "I came back," she confirmed, kneeling to gather them all as close as she could. "And I'm never leaving again, never ever again." Over their heads, her eyes met Jonathan's, and she saw her own determination reflected there. Whatever came next, gossip or scandal or social disapproval, they would face it together. They would build something strong enough to weather any storm. "Come on," Jonathan said, his voice warm with love and promise. "Let's get inside before we all catch pneumonia. We have a wedding to plan." The word sent a thrill through Isabella that she felt all the way to her toes. A wedding, a future, a family that was truly, legally, irrevocably hers. As they crowded through the door into the warmth of the kitchen, with the storm raging outside and love filling every corner of the house, Isabella realized that sometimes the most beautiful things in life came not from perfection but from the courage to try again after you'd failed. She had found her way home at last, not to a place, but to the people who loved her exactly as she was, flawed and frightened and fighting to be brave. And this time, nothing and no one would make her leave again. Thunder rolled across the prairie, but inside the Kane house there was only warmth and laughter and the sound of a family coming back together. Isabella looked around at the faces of the people she loved most in the world and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The storm would pass, as storms always did, but what they were building together, this fierce, imperfect, beautiful love, would last forever. The warmth of the kitchen enveloped them like an embrace as they crowded through the door, dripping rainwater onto the worn wooden floors that Isabella had scrubbed so many times before. The children clung to her still, as if afraid she might vanish again, like morning mist, their small hands fisted in the soggy fabric of her dress. "Mama's all wet," Theo observed with the matter-of-fact tone that children used for stating the obvious, but his arms remained locked around her waist. "So is Papa," Emma added, though she made no move to release Isabella's hand. "You're both going to catch your death standing there in those soaked clothes." Isabella felt her heart swell at the gentle scolding at being included so naturally in Emma's maternal concerns. This was what she'd thrown away, what she'd been too frightened to claim, this beautiful, chaotic, loving family that had somehow decided she belonged with them. "Emma's right," Jonathan said, his voice still rough with emotion, but warmer now, more like the man she remembered before her cowardice had wounded them both. "Isabella, you should get into some dry things. I think Sarah's dresses are still—" He trailed off, the mention of his first wife's name creating a moment of awkward silence. Isabella felt the children tense around her, waiting to see how she would react to this reminder of the woman who had held this place before her. "I would be honored to wear something of Sarah's," Isabella said quietly, meaning every word. She must have been a remarkable woman to have raised such wonderful children. The relief on Jonathan's face was immediate and profound. In that simple acceptance, Isabella had given him permission to honor his first wife's memory while still making room for their new beginning. "I'll get them," Emma offered, already moving toward the stairs. "Mama's dresses are in the cedar chest in Papa's room." "Thank you, sweetheart," Isabella said, and Emma beamed at the endearment as if it were a precious gift. While Emma rummaged upstairs, Isabella found herself the center of attention from the other three children, all of them talking at once in their eagerness to share everything that had happened during her 4-day absence. "The kittens opened their eyes," Jacob announced importantly, "and one of them is all orange, like sunshine. I helped Papa with the horses every day," James added, not to be outdone. "He said I was almost as good as a grown-up." "I drew you a picture," Theo said shyly, producing a piece of paper from his pocket. It was wrinkled and slightly damp, but Isabella could make out crude figures that might have been a woman and children holding hands. "It's our family," he explained unnecessarily. Isabella felt tears threaten again as she studied the drawing. "It's beautiful, Theo. It's the most beautiful picture I've ever seen." "Really, really and truly. I'm going to keep it forever." Theo's smile could have lit up the entire house. Emma returned with an armload of clothing, a simple brown dress that looked like it would fit along with undergarments and a thick wool shawl. "These were some of Mama's everyday things," she said, her voice carefully neutral. I thought you might like them." Isabella accepted the clothes with reverent hands, understanding the gift Emma was offering. This wasn't just about practical necessities, it was about acceptance, about permission to take Sarah's place in this family without erasing her memory. "Thank you," Isabella said, kissing Emma's forehead gently. "I'll take very good care of them." She changed quickly in the small room off the kitchen, grateful to shed her sodden dress and chilled undergarments. Sarah's clothes fit almost perfectly, as if they had been meant for her, and Isabella felt a strange sense of continuity as she fastened the buttons and tied the shawl. She was not replacing Sarah Kane, she was continuing the work of loving this family that Sarah had begun. When she emerged, she found Jonathan had also changed into dry clothes and was building up the fire while the children clustered around the hearth. The domestic scene was so perfect, so right, that Isabella had to pause in the doorway just to drink it in. This was what she'd almost lost. This was what her fear had nearly destroyed. "Better?" Jonathan asked, looking up from the fire to meet her eyes. "Much," Isabella replied, though she wasn't just talking about the dry clothes. They spent the evening in the kind of comfortable domesticity that Isabella had dreamed of, but never dared hope for. She helped Emma prepare a simple supper while the boys recounted their week's adventures, and Theo remained attached to her side like a devoted shadow. Jonathan said little, but his eyes followed her around the kitchen with an expression of wonder, as if he too was marveling at how right this felt. As they sat down to eat, James suddenly spoke up with the blunt curiosity of childhood. "Are you going to marry Papa now? For real this time?" Isabella felt her cheeks flush, but before she could answer, Jonathan reached across the table and took her hand. "That depends," he said, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. "Isabella, will you marry me not because it's expected or convenient, or because the children need a mother, but because I love you and want to spend the rest of my life with you?" It was the second time he'd proposed, but this time felt entirely different. This time there was no uncertainty, no fear of hypothetical futures or social disapproval. There was only love, pure and strong and certain. "Yes," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jonathan Kane. I'll marry you and love you and help you raise these beautiful children, and I promise I'll never run away from you again." The children erupted in cheers, and even Emma, always so careful with her emotions, was grinning widely. Theo launched himself from his chair into Isabella's lap, chattering excitedly about the wedding and whether he could carry the rings. "When?" Jacob demanded practically. When are you getting married? Jonathan and Isabella looked at each other, and Isabella saw her own impatience reflected in his eyes. They had already wasted so much time on fear and misunderstanding. Why wait any longer? Soon, Jonathan said firmly. Very soon. Tomorrow, Emma asked hopefully. Well, perhaps not quite that soon, Isabella laughed. We'll need time to arrange things properly to get a license to next week. Jonathan interrupted, his voice brooking no argument. I'm not waiting any longer than that. We've already lost too much time. Isabella felt her heart race at the determination in his voice. Next week, she agreed breathlessly. The following days passed in a whirlwind of preparation and excitement. Word of the engagement spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire, bringing with it a mixture of reactions that Isabella found she could face with equanimity, now that she had Jonathan's unwavering support. Mrs. Cartwright predictably was scandalized by the speed of the engagement and made her displeasure known to anyone who would listen. But for every disapproving matron, there seemed to be 3 women who were genuinely happy for the match, who had watched the Kane family struggle and were glad to see them finding joy again. Dr. Morrison was delighted, taking full credit for Isabella's change of heart, with a smugness that might have been annoying if it weren't so well-deserved. Martha Chen threw herself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm, insisting on organizing a reception at the church that would be a proper celebration of new beginnings. The children were in their element, each taking on specific responsibilities with the seriousness of seasoned wedding planners. Emma appointed herself chief advisor on all matters related to the ceremony, consulting books and magazines to ensure everything would be perfect. The twins competed to see who could gather the most wildflowers for decorations, while Theo practiced walking solemnly down the church aisle with an imaginary ring pillow. But perhaps the most meaningful preparation came from an unexpected source. 3 days before the wedding, Emma appeared in the kitchen with a wrapped package in her hands, her expression unusually shy. I have something for you, she said, placing the package carefully on the table. It was my mama's. Papa said I could give it to you if I wanted to. Isabella's hands trembled as she unwrapped the tissue paper, revealing a delicate lace veil that must have been beautiful even when new. Now yellowed with age but still intact, it spoke of love and hope and the continuity of family traditions. Emma, Isabella breathed, I can't possibly. This should be saved for you for your own wedding someday. No, Emma said firmly, her voice stronger now. Mama would want you to have it. She would want you to feel beautiful when you marry Papa, and she would want... Emma's voice broke slightly. She would want you to know that you're not taking her place. You're making your own place, but you're still part of our family story. Isabella felt tears blur her vision as she pulled the girl into her arms. Oh, sweetheart, you are so wise, so generous. Your mama raised an extraordinary daughter, and now you're going to help raise her too, Emma said, her own tears falling freely. And you're going to be the best mama to all of us. I'm going to try my very best, Isabella promised. The night before the wedding, Isabella lay awake in her small room at the boarding house, staring at Sarah's veil hanging carefully on the wardrobe door. Tomorrow she would wear another woman's dress, another woman's veil, and marry the man who had first belonged to someone else. By rights, it should have felt strange or wrong or like settling for second best. Instead, it felt like coming home. She thought about Sarah Kane, the woman she'd never met, but whose presence had shaped so much of her own story. From everything she'd learned, Sarah had been kind, loving, devoted to her family. Isabella liked to think they would have been friends under different circumstances, that Sarah would approve of the woman who was stepping in to love her children and cherish her husband. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie. Isabella opened it to find Martha Chen standing in the hallway with a cup of tea and a knowing smile. Couldn't sleep either, Martha asked, inviting herself in with the privilege of true friendship. Too excited, I think, Isabella admitted, accepting the tea gratefully. Or too nervous. It's natural, you know, to have doubts the night before your wedding, even when you're absolutely certain you're doing the right thing. Isabella sipped her tea thoughtfully. I don't have doubts about Jonathan or the children, she said slowly. I just keep thinking about Sarah, about whether I'll be able to fill the space she left behind. Oh, my dear girl, Martha said gently, settling beside her on the narrow bed. You're not meant to fill Sarah's space. You're meant to create your own space, right alongside hers, in their hearts. Emma said almost the same thing. Emma is a very wise child. She understands something that many adults struggle with, that love doesn't diminish when it's shared. Jonathan's love for Sarah doesn't make his love for you any less real or precious. The children's memories of their first mother don't make their love for their second mother any less genuine. Isabella felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. When you put it like that, it sounds so simple. The best truths usually are. Martha smiled. Now you should try to get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a very big day. But even after Martha left, Isabella found sleep elusive. She rose before dawn and dressed carefully, then walked to the church as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. She wanted a few moments alone in the sanctuary before the day began in earnest, a chance to gather her thoughts and say a prayer for the family she was about to officially join. The church was cool and quiet, with dust motes dancing in the early morning light that streamed through the stained glass windows. Isabella walked slowly down the aisle she would soon walk as a bride, letting the peace of the sacred space settle into her bones. She was kneeling in the front pew, lost in prayer, when she heard the church door open behind her. She turned to see Jonathan silhouetted in the doorway, looking almost as nervous as she felt. I'm sorry, he said, starting to back away. I didn't know you were here. I can come back later. No, stay, Isabella said, rising to her feet. I think we both had the same idea. Jonathan walked down the aisle toward her, and Isabella was struck by how right he looked in his Sunday best. His dark hair neatly combed his face, clean-shaven. This man was going to be her husband in just a few hours. Having second thoughts, he asked, his tone light, but his eyes serious. Never, Isabella said firmly. You, not a single one. Jonathan reached for her hands, intertwining their fingers. Isabella, I know this has all happened very quickly. I know there are people who think we're rushing into this, that we should wait longer, be more conventional about it. Do you care what they think? Not even a little bit. Jonathan's smile was radiant. I've learned that life is too short and too uncertain to waste time on other people's opinions. I love you. You love me. The children adore you, and we have a chance to build something beautiful together. Why would we wait? Isabella felt her remaining nervousness melt away under the warmth of his certainty. I love you too, she said simply. More than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone. They stood there in the quiet church, holding hands and smiling at each other like the pair of besotted fools they undoubtedly were, until the sound of voices outside reminded them that their wedding day was about to begin. I should go, Jonathan said reluctantly. It's bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony. We've already had our share of bad luck, Isabella pointed out. From now on, it's going to be nothing but good fortune. Jonathan kissed her softly, a promise of all the kisses to come. I'll see you at the altar, Mrs. Kane. The name sent a thrill through Isabella that she felt all the way to her toes. I'll be the one in the borrowed dress and the old veil, trying not to cry. Cry all you want, Jonathan said, his own eyes suspiciously bright. I have a feeling I'm going to be doing some crying myself. The hours that followed were a blur of activity and emotion. Martha and several other women from town arrived to help Isabella with her preparations, fussing over her hair and dress and exclaiming over Sarah's beautiful veil. The children appeared periodically to check on progress, each one contributing their own brand of helpful chaos to the proceedings. Emma had appointed herself Isabella's chief attendant and took her duties seriously, making sure Isabella had something old, the veil, something new, a pair of gloves Martha had purchased, something borrowed, a pearl bracelet from Dr. Sun, Morrison's wife, and something blue, a garter that made Isabella blush when Martha presented it. As the appointed hour drew near, Isabella found herself standing at the back of the church, with Emma beside her and the three boys lined up as groomsmen. The sanctuary was packed with what seemed like half of Millbrook, all of them dressed in their finest clothes and talking in the excited whispers that accompanied all good weddings. "Are you ready, Mama?" Theo asked, looking up at her with complete trust and adoration. Isabella looked down at this precious child, who had claimed her as his own, then at the other three children who were watching her with equal love and excitement. At the front of the church, Jonathan stood waiting with Dr. Morrison at his side as best man, his face radiant with joy and anticipation. "I'm ready," Isabella said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The music began, Martha playing the old pump organ with more enthusiasm than skill, and Isabella began her walk down the aisle toward her future. She was dimly aware of the congregation rising to their feet, of faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from warm approval to grudging acceptance, but her focus was entirely on the man waiting for her at the altar. Jonathan's eyes never left her face as she approached, and Isabella could see tears of joy gathering in them. When she reached him and he took her hand, she felt a sense of rightness so profound that she wondered how she had ever doubted that this was meant to be. Pastor Chen's voice was warm and sure as he began the ceremony, speaking of love and commitment, of the sacred bond of marriage and the blessing of family. But Isabella barely heard the traditional words. All of her attention was focused on Jonathan, on the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When it came time for their vows, Jonathan spoke first, his voice strong and clear despite the emotion that roughened it. "Isabella, I promise to love you not just as my wife, but as the woman who brought joy back into my life and light back into my children's eyes. I promise to stand by you through whatever storms may come, to support your dreams and celebrate your victories, and to never let fear or pride come between us again." Isabella felt tears streaming down her face as she spoke her own vows in return. "Jonathan, I promise to love you and your children, our children, with all my heart for all the days of my life. I promise to be brave enough to trust in this love we've built, to face whatever challenges come our way together, and to create with you a home filled with laughter and warmth and endless second chances." When Pastor Chen pronounced them husband and wife, and Jonathan kissed her with gentle reverence, Isabella felt something settle into place in her heart that had been searching for home her entire life. The celebration that followed was everything Martha had promised, and more. The church hall had been transformed with wildflowers and candles, and tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by every family in town. There was music and dancing, toasts and laughter, and enough joy to light up the prairie sky. But the moment that would stay with Isabella forever came late in the evening, when the formal festivities had wound down and she found herself surrounded by her new family in a quiet corner of the hall. Emma was leaning against her side, tired but happy. The twins were sprawled at her feet, full of cake and contentment. Theo had fallen asleep in her lap, his small hand still clutching a piece of wedding cake. Jonathan sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, watching their children with an expression of wonder and gratitude. "Happy?" he asked quietly. Isabella looked around at these precious faces, at the man who had chosen to love her despite her flaws, at the children who had accepted her as their own without reservation. She thought about the long, lonely years that had brought her to this moment, about all the pain and fear and heartbreak that had almost kept her from claiming this beautiful life. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," she said softly. As they gathered their sleepy children and prepared to head home to their ranch, now Isabella realized with a thrill she felt a deep sense of completion. She was Isabella Kane, now wife and mother and mistress of her own house, part of a family that had chosen her as surely as she had chosen them. The future stretched ahead of them, full of ordinary days and extraordinary moments of challenges to face and joys to celebrate. There would be seasons of plenty and seasons of want, times of sorrow and times of celebration. But whatever came, they would face it together, bound by love and strengthened by the knowledge that they had found in each other exactly what they needed. As Jonathan helped her into the wagon for the ride home, Isabella looked back at the church where she had just pledged her life to this man and this family. Tomorrow the gossips would have new topics to discuss. The seasons would continue their eternal cycle and life would go on as it always had in Millbrook. But tonight, under a sky full of stars and a moon that smiled down like a blessing, Isabella Kane was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by love, protected by commitment, and finally truly home. The wagon wheels turned steadily on the familiar road, carrying them toward a future that was brighter than any dream Isabella had ever dared to dream. In her arms, Theo slept peacefully secure in the knowledge that his safe lady would never leave him again. Beside her, Jonathan hummed quietly, his joy too large to contain in silence. This was what grace looked like, Isabella thought, as the ranch house came into view, with warm light spilling from its windows. This was what happened when fear finally surrendered to love, when broken hearts found the courage to trust again, when families were built not just from blood, but from choice and commitment, and the kind of fierce devotion that could weather any storm. Isabella Kane was home at last, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would never have to search for belonging again. She had found it here in the arms of a man who loved her exactly as she was, surrounded by children who called her mama, on a piece of prairie that would always be her refuge and her joy. The rest of their story lay ahead of them, full of promise and possibility, and Isabella could hardly wait to begin living every precious day of it. The first year of marriage brought changes to the Kane Ranch that went far beyond Isabella's legal status as wife and mother. It was as if her presence had awakened something dormant in the very soil, breathing life into corners that had been shadowed by grief for too long. Isabella threw herself into making the house truly theirs, not by erasing Sarah's memory, but by weaving new traditions alongside the old ones. She planted an herb garden behind the kitchen, teaching Emma the healing properties of various plants, while the boys helped dig and water. The parlor that had once felt like a museum to the past became a living space again, filled with the children's laughter and the sound of Isabella reading aloud on winter evenings. But perhaps the most significant change came in the way the family had begun to open their hearts and home to others who were struggling. It started small, Isabella treating a traveling family's sick child when their wagon broke down near the ranch. The parents had no money to pay, but Isabella waved away their apologies. "Sometimes the payment isn't in coin," she told them gently. "Sometimes it's in knowing you've made a difference." Jonathan, watching from the kitchen doorway as Isabella bandaged the child's infected cut, felt something stir in his chest. This was who Isabella truly was, not the frightened woman who had almost run away from love, but the healer who saw need and responded without thought of reward. "We have plenty of room," he said quietly to the grateful parents. "Stay the night. Your little one needs rest, and travel will be easier in the morning." Isabella's eyes met his across the kitchen, and the smile they shared was full of understanding. This was how they wanted to live, with open hands and hearts, creating the kind of home where broken things could heal. Word spread slowly but surely that the Kane Ranch was a place where people in trouble could find help. A young widow with 2 children arrived one winter morning, half frozen and desperate. Isabella took one look at the woman's hollow cheeks and the fear in her children's eyes, and made a decision that would change all their lives. "You'll stay with us through the winter," she announced, ignoring Jonathan's raised eyebrows. "There's a room above the barn that we can fix up, and we can always use extra hands with the spring planting." "I can't pay," the woman began, but Isabella cut her off. "Mary," she said, having learned the woman's name. "When I was at my lowest point, this family took me in. Not because I could pay them, but because that's what families do for each other. And we're all family here on the prairie, whether we share blood or not." Mary stayed through the winter, and then through the spring, and by summer she was as integral to the ranch operations as any of them. Her children, shy and suspicious at first, gradually relaxed under the gentle care of the Kane family, eventually becoming playmates and pseudo-siblings to Emma, James, Jacob, and Theo. "We're collecting strays," Jonathan observed one evening as they watched the expanded brood of children playing in the yard before bedtime. "Is that a problem?" Isabella asked, settling beside him on the porch swing he'd built for their first anniversary. Jonathan pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "It's the best kind of problem to have," he said honestly. "Isabella, what you've created here, this feeling of home, of safety, it's something special." Isabella leaned into his warmth, watching Theo chase Mary's youngest daughter around the oak tree where she'd first found him. "It's not just me," she said. "It's all of us. Even the children understand what we're trying to build here." She was right. Emma had become a natural teacher, helping the younger children with their letters and numbers. The twins had appointed themselves protectors of anyone smaller or more vulnerable, while Theo, despite being one of the youngest, seemed to have an instinct for knowing when someone needed comfort. But it was during their second year of marriage that the true test of their commitment to this vision came. Isabella was in town picking up supplies when she overheard Mrs. Cartwright holding court outside the general store, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "It's becoming quite the scandal," the older woman was saying to a cluster of attentive listeners. "That Kane place is turning into some sort of charity house for every ne'er-do-well and vagrant who happens through town." "Now, Helen," Martha Chen's voice joined the conversation, "the Kanes are just being Christian neighbors." "Christian neighbors don't encourage laziness and dependency," Mrs. Cartwright snapped. "And they certainly don't expose their own children to Lord knows what kind of influences. Why, that Mary woman they've taken in, no one knows anything about her past. She could be fleeing from anything." Isabella felt the familiar clench of anxiety in her stomach, the old fear that maybe the gossips were right. Maybe she was bringing shame on Jonathan and the children. But then she thought about Mary, gentle, hard-working Mary, who helped with the washing and cooking and never took more than she gave. She thought about Mary's children, who had bloomed under care and attention, who were learning to laugh again after whatever tragedy had driven them from their previous life. "Good morning, Mrs. Cartwright," Isabella said pleasantly, approaching the group with her chin held high. "I couldn't help but overhear your concern for our family. It's very kind of you to take such an interest." Mrs. Cartwright's face flushed, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I was merely expressing my opinion that perhaps the Kane Ranch has become a bit too welcoming for its own good." "How interesting," Isabella said, her voice remaining perfectly calm. "I was just thinking this morning how blessed we are to have room in our lives for people who need a helping hand. It seems like such a small thing to offer a warm bed, a safe place for children to play, the chance for someone to get back on their feet. But the influence on your own children has been entirely positive," Isabella interrupted firmly. "My children are learning compassion, generosity, and the joy that comes from helping others. They're learning that family isn't just about blood, but about love and commitment and choosing to care for each other." She looked around at the small crowd that had gathered, meeting each pair of eyes steadily. "If that's the kind of influence you're worried about, Mrs. Cartwright, then I hope it spreads to every child in Millbrook." With that, Isabella collected her supplies and walked away, leaving Mrs. Cartwright sputtering behind her. But as she drove the wagon home, she found herself thinking not about the confrontation, but about her own words. The children were learning compassion and generosity, but more than that, they were learning that love wasn't a finite resource that could be used up or diminished by sharing. That evening, she shared the encounter with Jonathan as they worked together in the barn, checking on Sunshine's latest litter of kittens. Are you worried? Jonathan asked, watching her face carefully. About what people are saying. 2 years ago, Isabella would have been terrified by the gossip, would have immediately begun planning ways to make their household more conventional. Now she found that other people's opinions seemed much less important than the reality of the life they'd built. No, she said, and was surprised to realize she meant it completely. Jonathan, I look at our dinner table every night, sometimes 8 or 10 people gathered around it, all of them fed and safe and cared for, and I can't imagine wanting anything different. Even if it means more talk, more criticism. Isabella picked up one of the kittens, smiling as it purred against her chest. Let them talk. We know who we are and what we're building here. The children know it too. That's what matters. Jonathan reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his eyes full of the love that still took her breath away. Have I told you lately that I married an extraordinary woman? Only every day. Isabella laughed, but I don't mind hearing it again. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of running feet and Emma's voice calling urgently from the house. Mama, Papa, come quick, there's someone at the door. They hurried toward the house to find a young man standing uncertainly on their porch hat, in hand clothes dusty from hard travel. He couldn't have been more than 19 or 20 with sandy hair and tired eyes that spoke of trouble. I'm sorry to bother you folks, he said as they approached. I was told in town that you might, that is, someone said you help people who are in difficult circumstances. Isabella and Jonathan exchanged glances. Another stray, another person in need of the kind of second chance they'd built their life on providing. What's your name, son? Jonathan asked gently. David Miller. I've been traveling for 3 weeks, looking for work. Looking for... He swallowed hard. Looking for a place to start over. What are you starting over from? Isabella asked, not unkindly. David's face crumpled slightly. I made some bad choices back in Kansas, got involved with the wrong people, ended up in trouble with the law. Nothing violent, he added quickly. But I took some money that wasn't mine, and when I paid it back, I knew I couldn't stay. People wouldn't forget, wouldn't forgive. Isabella felt her heart ache for this young man, who reminded her so much of herself, someone carrying shame, someone who believed his mistakes had marked him permanently. Are you running from the law now? Jonathan asked practically. No, sir. I made restitution, served my time, but you know how it is in small towns. Once people know your business. Oh, yes, Isabella said softly. I know exactly how it is. David looked up at her, something in her tone catching his attention. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Two people who understood what it meant to be marked by past mistakes, to be searching for a place where you could be more than the worst thing you'd ever done. Are you hungry? Isabella asked. Yes, ma'am. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Then come inside. We can talk more after you've had a decent meal. As they walked toward the house, Jonathan caught Isabella's arm gently. You know what people will say, he murmured. A young man living here with our family. Isabella smiled at him. Let them say it. We know the truth about our marriage, about our commitment to each other, and more importantly, we know what's right. Dinner that night was a lively affair, with David gradually relaxing under the gentle teasing of the twins, and Emma's motherly attention to making sure he had enough to eat. Theo, ever the judge of character, had declared David nice and appointed himself the young man's tour guide. After the children were in bed, the 3 adults sat around the kitchen table while David told his story more fully. It was a familiar tale of youthful foolishness, bad companions, and a moment of weakness that had spiraled into life-altering consequences. I don't expect charity, David said earnestly. I can work for my keep. I'm good with horses, decent with carpentry, and I learn fast. We could use help with the spring building projects, Jonathan mused, and if you're planning to stay in the area, you'll need references, people who can vouch for your character. You do that, even knowing what I've done. Isabella reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. David, I was once cast off by my own family for something beyond my control. Jonathan was once so broken by grief that he almost lost his children to neglect. Mary upstairs was once so desperate that she walked 30 miles in a blizzard with 2 small children rather than stay where she was. She looked around the table at the 2 men who had become so important to her, her husband and this young stranger who needed what they had learned to give. "This house is built on second chances," she continued. "Every person in it has been broken in some way, has needed grace and forgiveness and the chance to become better than they were. If you're willing to work hard and be honest with us, then yes, you can stay." David's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "Thank us by becoming the man you want to be," Jonathan said simply. "That's all any of us can do." By the end of their 3rd year of marriage, the Kane Ranch had become something unique in that part of Nebraska. They were still a working cattle ranch, but they were also a refuge, a place where people could come to heal and start over. The original house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family of choice, and the barn now included quarters for temporary guests and permanent residents like Mary and David. The children thrived in this environment of expanded love and purpose. Emma, now 15, had become Isabella's apprentice in both healing arts and the delicate work of helping newcomers feel welcome. The twins at 11 had developed into natural leaders among the younger children who came and went, and Theo, now 7, had appointed himself the official greeter of anyone who arrived at their door seeking help. Isabella often marveled at how naturally the children had adapted to their unusual household. They seemed to understand instinctively that love multiplied rather than divided, that there was always room for one more at their table, one more person in their circle of care. "Do you ever miss it?" Jonathan asked one evening as they sat on their porch watching a group of children play in the yard before bedtime. "The quiet life we used to have, just the 6 of us." Isabella considered the question seriously. Their life now was certainly more complicated, more demanding, more open to criticism from those who didn't understand their vision. But as she watched Theo teaching a new arrival how to feed the chickens, as she saw Emma patiently helping Mary's daughter with her reading, as she observed David showing James the proper way to mend a fence, she felt nothing but gratitude. "I wouldn't trade this for anything," she said firmly. "Jonathan, look what we've built. Look at what the children are learning about kindness and acceptance and using their blessings to bless others. Even when it means more work, more worry, more mouths to feed." Isabella leaned into his embrace, secure in the knowledge that he was asking not because he regretted their choices, but because he loved her enough to make sure she didn't. "Especially then," she said, "because it means we're living up to the grace we were given. We were both broken when we found each other, both in need of second chances and new beginnings. How could we not offer the same to others?" Jonathan pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Mrs. Kane, you are the wisest woman I've ever known." "No," Isabella corrected gently. "I'm just a woman who learned that love isn't something you hoard, it's something you share, and the more you share it, the more you have." As if to prove her point, Theo came running up to the porch, his face bright with excitement. "Mama, Papa David says tomorrow he's going to teach me how to carve a whistle, and Mary's going to show Emma how to make that special bread, and James and Jacob want to build a treehouse for all the little kids." Isabella smiled at his enthusiasm, at the easy way he included everyone into his plans. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart, but right now it's time to get ready for bed. Can I read to the little ones tonight, please?" It had become one of Theo's favorite responsibilities, reading bedtime stories to whichever small children were currently staying with them. Isabella nodded, and Theo scampered off to gather his audience. "That boy of ours," Jonathan said, watching Theo organize the children with the efficiency of a general, "he's going to change the world someday." "They all are," Isabella said confidently. "Emma with her healing gifts and her compassionate heart. James and Jacob with their leadership and their sense of justice. They're learning that they have the power to make life better for people who are struggling, and that's a lesson that will serve them well, no matter what they choose to do. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Isabella felt a deep sense of completion settle over her. This life they had built was so much richer and more meaningful than anything she had dared to imagine in those early days when she'd first arrived in Millbrook, broken and ashamed and convinced that she had nothing to offer the world. Now she knew better. Everyone had something to offer: love, kindness, hope, the simple gift of seeing others as worthy of care and respect. The Cane Ranch had become a place where those gifts were both given and received freely, where broken people could come to heal and whole people could come to serve. "Thank you," she said softly to Jonathan. "For what? For seeing who I could become before I could see it myself. For giving me a family, a purpose, a chance to use my scars to help heal other people's wounds." Jonathan's arms tightened around her. "Isabella, you gave me the same gift. You brought joy back into this house, hope back into my heart. You turned 4 grieving children into a family again." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their unusual household settling in for the night. Through the open windows they could hear Theo's voice reading a story about brave knights and kind princesses. From the barn came the soft lowing of cattle and the occasional whinny of a horse. In the distance, a train whistle blew, carrying other travelers toward their own destinations and destinies. "Do you think we'll be remembered?" Isabella asked suddenly. "Years from now, when all the people we've helped have moved on to build their own lives, do you think anyone will remember what we tried to do here?" Jonathan considered the question carefully. "Maybe not us specifically," he said finally, "but I think the kindness will be remembered. The children we've raised and helped will remember what it felt like to be welcomed, to be seen as valuable, to be given a chance. And they'll pass that on to their own children and to the people they meet who need hope." Isabella nodded, satisfied by his answer. She had never needed to be remembered by name or celebrated for her contributions. It was enough to know that the love they had planted would continue growing long after they were gone, spreading through the lives they had touched, like ripples on water. As they rose to go inside and check on their extended family one last time before bed, Isabella took a moment to look around at the home they had built together. The house with its expanded walls and numerous windows, all glowing with warm light. The barn with its sturdy construction and welcoming spaces. The gardens and fields that provided sustenance for anyone who needed it. But most of all, she looked at the man beside her, the widower who had been brave enough to love again, the father who had opened his home and heart to anyone in need, the husband who had seen past her shame and fear to the woman she could become. This was their legacy, Isabella realized. Not wealth or fame or monuments built of stone, but a tradition of welcome, a heritage of healing, a family built not just on blood, but on choice and commitment and the radical belief that everyone deserved a second chance at happiness. As they walked inside together, hand in hand, Isabella smiled at the thought of all the tomorrows that lay ahead of them. There would be new people to help new challenges, to face new opportunities, to prove that love was indeed the most powerful force in the world, and she could hardly wait to begin.